Hi everybody. I'm going to present some highlights of the conservation treatment of a 15th century Italian antiphonary and a one-of-a-kind device built to store, transport, and display it. I hope that this presentation will help colleagues who are dealing with or will deal with similar items and inspire them to think outside the box and be innovative. The 20 kilograms volume arrived in our lab in need of major structural repairs. Both wooden boards were almost detached, and the two-layer leather spine was lifted and loose. The sewing structure was still functional, and the parchment text block was in decent condition. Only the non-contemporary paper fly leaves needed some immediate attention. This volume is the only medieval antiphonary on parchment in its period binding at the Johns Hopkins Library. It's used by researchers and students and displayed for book history classes or during fundraising events. Given the nature of our library, the University Research Library, the primary goal of any conservation treatment is to give access to our materials. So we're always trying to strike a balance between reestablishing lost functionalities and minimum intervention. It was decided to prioritize the consolidation of the binding over any treatment of the illuminations or text, which was postponed for a later date. The first couple of questions that came to my mind while planning the treatment were: can I create new board attachments without touching the copper alloy strips on the spine edge of the board? Can I reback it while keeping those strips in place? The core of my presentation will focus on presenting the main techniques that helped me answering these questions positively. They include how I extended the sewing support for the new mechanical board attachment, how I prepared the boards for the new mechanical board attachment, how I lined the spine to improve its movement and provide additional glue-based board attachments, how I rebacked the volume. This is a simple rendering of my original plan for extending the cords. New linen threads, longer than the spine width, wrap the supports and are secured to them by a simple cross stitch. The increased numbers of loops at the joints counteract the high forces applied to the joint areas while opening the boards. I was not concerned with the increased diameter of the final supports because I was not planning to reuse the already shaped original spine. The added linen threads would have protected the original supports without interfering too much with their natural behavior, and, given the size of the volume, would have not compromised the aesthetics of the new spine. It's not a new technique, it's relatively simple to execute. Unfortunately, just after completing one extension, my supervisor asked me to undo it and proceed with a different technique. I would not have mentioned this if it were not an integral part of the story of this treatment, and if they were not instrumental in understanding why the technique I eventually used was not my first choice. This is what I ended up doing. It's a variant of one of the border reattachment techniques described by Bernard Middleton in his famous book about restoring leather bindings. In his version, the two ends of a thread come out from the center of a section at the sides of the sewing support. Several threads, similarly added along the support every other few sections, form the extension that will reattach the board. A separate set of threads then secure it to the original support with single loops. My variation uses a single thread to form both the extension and the securing loop. Starting from the center of the spine and moving towards the joints, any new loop includes the previously formed extension and secure it to the support. Performed with the book closed in a press, it eliminates the dangerous need of opening the text block dozens of times to find and work at the center of the gatherings. Both versions have a place in the toolbox of a book conservator, but neither of them was the best option in this case, for two main reasons. First, they split the supports in 3 segments, which act differently when the spine moves, creating areas where cracks might form and propagate to the lining structure in kettles. Second, the distribution of applied forces during the opening of the boards is different. With any of these techniques, on the left, any vertical pulling, green arrows, is transferred to the original sewing, in yellow, because the new thread directly pushes it. Otherwise, with the wrapping technique, on the right, any vertical pulling is distributed along the entire length of the new thread up to the attachment to the opposite board. The original sewing is independent from it and under much less stress. Soon after creating the support extensions, due to personnel changes within my department, I was able to regain control over my work. I planned and performed all the following steps of the treatment autonomously, with the full support of my new supervisor. The original lacing-in holes were too large to be useful. Smaller holes would have reduced any wobbling of the attached board, and the added material would have protected the original wood, which was quite thin over the holes. My solution to create smaller holes was to use a cord as a jig. Its diameter was chosen to mirror the size of the ideal hole. This is how. The template cord was wrapped in paper. The combo was introduced into the hole. All gaps on the spine edge and the inner board were filled with the poultice of cord fragments and gelatin. The goal was to obtain an extremely rigid filling. A similar technique was actually used originally to fix the support ends to the inner boards. Once the poultice dried, the paper was trimmed and the loose cord removed. The picture on the right shows a hole before and after its size reduction. A minor advantage of this technique is that the laced-in new threads will be in contact with a softer paper instead of the rigid wood or cord gelatin filling. The next big conundrum was to design a spine line that would stabilize and reinforce the mechanical board attachment without disturbing the metal edges. It was immediately clear that the only practical option was to introduce the edges of the lining into the space between the boards and the metal edges, and glue them down to the spine edge of the boards. The thickness of the boards, at least 15 millimeters, made this solution feasible. The diagram in this slide shows my general plan for a multi-layer lining consisting of a paper barrier, a reinforcing cotton layer that will form part of the inner joints, and a double layer of animal skin that will form the outer joints. I decided to use 2 layers of skin to better manage the weight of the wooden boards and alleviate the load over the primary sewing of a text block when it's open. The diagram shows continuous or overall linings, but only for better visualizing the stratification. The actual linings were transverse or panel linings. Moreover, nothing was stuck on top of the sewing supports. They were loosely covered with pieces of papers adhered for about 10 millimeters to the adjacent panels on top of the first paper barrier lining. To bypass the physical interference of the metal and be able to glue down the animal skins on the spine edges of the boards, I divided the lining process into several steps and combined the lining pieces into 2 symmetric 2-layer components. Component 1-2, light brown, and component 3-4, dark brown. The 2 individual pieces making a component, for example, pieces 1 and 2, are different in size. One covers the whole spine, the other only the joint area. By pairing to nothing the edges of both components, as is shown in the diagram, once they are both attached to the spine, the overall thickness of the final lining equals 2 skin thicknesses everywhere, forming a uniform structure and a smooth, round surface. The attachment of each component would have started from the spine edge of the board while keeping the board open and ended on the spine after closing the board. Those pictures describe the first step of attaching component 1-2. It was glued down to the spine edge of the right board. Loose cotton was used to press it against the spine edge during the drying phase. The cotton was eventually substituted by poultice made of cord fragments and a combination of wheat starch and a small quantity of jade 304. The idea, or hope, behind this formulation was to avoid an uncontrollable shrinkage of the poultice deep inside the slot and provide a more flexible and shock-absorbent filling. It seems to work fine as intended. After the poultice dried, the board was closed and the rest of component 1-2 was glued down on the spine, second step in the diagram. These pictures show all the subsequent steps. Once component 1-2 was attached and paired, component 3-4 was added in the same way, but starting from the open left board. Finally, pairing its edges and slightly sanding the whole surface completed the lining process. This slide summarizes all the different board attachments. The support extensions were passed through the reduced holes, knotted on the inner board, trimmed, and glued down into the concave space originally carved into the board for the same purpose. Photos at the top. More cord gelatin filling would eventually create a leveled surface. The multi-layer lining provided the outer joints and part of the inner joints with a transverse cotton layer. Photos in the middle. Finally, a paper cotton gusset completed the inner joint and hid the whole structure. Photos at the bottom. The final treatment technique I would like to present is the patched reback. I know it sounds weird, but it worked. It only had an aesthetical function since the structural strength was already provided by the various board attachments. The reback consisted of 3 steps: covering the gaps between adjacent panels of the joint, circled in green, covering the thick supports, circled in blue, and finally covering all the panels, picture on the right. The gaps between the new cover had a head and tail, and the corners of the boards were bridged with several layers of paper carefully arranged to make the transition both seamless and functional. The paper was eventually toned with acrylics. The implementation of this technique was greatly facilitated by using a height-adjustable book press, picture at the bottom left corner, that allowed the antiphonary to be held in a vertical position tilted at any angle, and gave him the option to work sitting or standing. The press worked fine for this treatment, but presented some technical and practical issues. They were all addressed with a completely redesigned electrical version, currently used in our conservation lab. Picture at the top left corner. That's me playing with my new toy. That's all for the conservation treatment. I will now briefly describe the device that I designed and built to preserve the volume. It's a cart, storage solution, and a cradle. The preservation goals were to eliminate the necessity to lift the volume, to simplify its general handling when in use, to facilitate its transportation around the library, to allow its safe display and consultation. Additional logistic and practical goals were to minimize the overall dimensions of the device to make it as user-friendly as possible. The device is made of aluminum plates lined with the black archival book cloth, anodized aluminum profiles for the frame, Volara for the parting contact with the leather spine of the volume, ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene for all areas in contact with the metal components of the binding, stainless steel bolts and nuts in proximity of the volume, black oxide steel bolts and nuts for the frame, red stop latches and black adjustable levers to lock or release the movable component, swivel casters with brakes. Once closed, the device is only about 5 centimeters longer and 12 centimeters wider than the volume. These numbers were obtained by designing sliding components and by carefully compartmentalizing the volume underneath the box at the top. This video will show you how to operate the device. Apology for my dress code. The casters are locked. The stabilizers are released, slid down to the floor, and locked. Their role will be clear in a moment. The handle is unlocked and pulled to the left. The right side of the box is unlocked and opened to the right. The left side of the box is unfolded. The volume is pushed to the left and vertically tilted on the spine. The left board is laid on its support. The right side of the box is closed back and becomes the support for the right board. The entire book can now be read from beginning to end without needing any further physical adjustment. The stabilizers add points of contact to the floor to prevent the whole structure from collapsing to the left to the cantilevered position of the open book at the top. For closing the box or cradle, all actions are simply reversed. The book is closed. The right side of the box is open. The book is laid back on the base of the box and slowly pushed to the right. The left side of the box is folded back. The handle is pushed back against the box and locked. The right side of the box is closed and locked. The stabilizers are slid back under the box and locked. The casters are unlocked. Big fragments are stored in reback sandwiches for easy consultation and circulation during classes or events. Otherwise, smaller fragments are stored in common zipper lock polyethylene bags. This video ends my presentation. If you have any questions or comments, do not hesitate to contact me. Thank you.